Arthur Miller's mornings had become indistinguishable from one another, marked by the weight of grief that hung over his life like a perpetual gray sky. Years ago, his days were filled with purpose, meetings, and accomplishments, but now they were defined by an unrelenting emptiness. At 55, his gray hair and solemn demeanor mirrored the life he led, one of wealth and success marred by an irreparable loss. 23 years ago, his wife, Clara, had passed away suddenly, leaving him tethered to memories and haunted by what could never be again. The day began like any other. Arthur left his mansion, a sprawling estate that felt cavernous without Clara's warmth. The corridors echoed his solitary footsteps, and every room seemed frozen in time, filled with her memory. The morning drizzle, accompanied by the city's muted hum, was the backdrop to his habitual walks. He didn't walk for exercise or leisure. He walked to feel something, anything, other than the hollow ache in his chest. As Arthur moved through the damp streets, his gaze wandered over the bustling crowd. People hurried to their destinations, umbrellas bobbing like restless waves. But then he noticed a young woman huddled beneath the awning of a small shop. She clutched a baby wrapped in a threadbare blanket, shielding it from the rain. Her face, pale and tired, bore the weight of exhaustion, but her eyes held a quiet resilience. Something about her stilled Arthur's steps. He hesitated before crossing the street toward her. Arthur rarely interacted with strangers, preferring the solitude of his grief to the discomfort of unfamiliar connections. Yet, there was an unspoken pull, a compulsion he couldn't explain. He stood before her, awkwardly clearing his throat. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. The woman, startled, looked up at him. Her brown eyes, ringed with fatigue, met his. "I'm just waiting for the rain to stop," she said softly, cradling the baby closer. Arthur glanced at the infant, its tiny face serene in sleep, and felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in years, compassion. Without thinking, he reached into his wallet and handed her several bills. "Buy something for yourself and the baby," he said. The woman hesitated before taking the money, her gratitude evident in the weak but genuine smile she offered. "Thank you," she whispered. Arthur nodded stiffly and walked away, his mind uncharacteristically unsettled. He had no reason to stop for her, yet he couldn't shake the image of her cradling her child in the rain. His feet led him to the cemetery, as they often did. The iron gates creaked as he pushed them open, and the familiar chill of the place settled over him. Rows of tombstones stretched before him, but only one mattered. Clara's grave, marked by a simple, elegant headstone, was tucked beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Arthur knelt, brushing away the fallen leaves from the inscription. "Clara Miller, beloved wife, forever in our hearts." He sat there for what felt like hours, speaking to Clara as he always did. He told her about his walks, the empty house, the business deals he no longer cared about. His voice cracked when he mentioned the young woman and her child. "I don't know why I stopped," he admitted, tracing the engraved letters of her name. "But she reminded me of something. Or someone. I can't explain it." The rain had stopped by the time Arthur returned home, but the encounter lingered in his thoughts. That night, he dreamed of Clara, not as she was in her final days, but vibrant and laughing, her hand reaching out to him. When he woke, the ache in his chest was heavier than ever. The next morning, unable to shake the feeling of restlessness, Arthur found himself back at the cemetery. As he approached Clara's grave, he froze. Someone was kneeling there, a figure familiar, yet out of place. It was the young woman from the day before. Her shoulders shook as she cradled her child, her head bowed in silence. Arthur's mind raced. How could she be here? Why would she be at Clara's grave? His confusion turned to unease as he stepped closer, his voice cutting through the stillness. "What are you doing here?" The woman turned, her face streaked with tears. For a moment, she seemed too stunned to speak. Finally, she took a shaky breath. I needed to come," she said. Her voice wavered, but there was resolve in her eyes. Arthur's gaze shifted to the baby in her arms, then back to her. "How do you know Clara?" he demanded, his tone sharper than he intended. The woman hesitated, clutching the child as if it were a shield. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled as she spoke the words that would shatter Arthur's world. "She was my mother." Arthur staggered back, disbelief etched on his face. "That's impossible," he said, shaking his head. "Clara never, she couldn't have." The words died on his lips as the woman's tears fell freely. "I found out recently," she said, her voice breaking. "She gave me up for adoption when I was born. I never knew her, but I found out about her, about this place." Arthur's mind reeled. He stared at her, searching for some sign that she was lying, but all he saw was raw, unfiltered pain. The truth of her words struck him like a blow. The woman, Isabel, she later introduced herself, was not just a stranger. She was a fragment of Clara, a piece of the life he thought he knew. The baby stirred in her arms, breaking the heavy silence. Arthur tore his gaze away, his thoughts spiraling. Questions swirled in his mind, each more unbearable than the last. How had Clara kept this from him? Why had she never told him? Arthur turned abruptly and walked away, his heart pounding. The world he had built around Clara's memory was crumbling, and he had no idea what lay beneath the rubble. Arthur's mind was a storm as he returned to his mansion, his feet moving on autopilot. Every memory of Clara, their conversations, her laughter, the quiet moments they shared, now felt suspect. Was it all a lie? The house, already silent and cold, seemed heavier than usual, as though even its walls had absorbed the betrayal he felt. He poured himself a glass of scotch, his trembling hand barely steady enough to hold it. His gaze fell on a portrait of Clara hanging above the fireplace. Her eyes, always full of warmth, now seemed to mock him. How could she have hidden something so monumental? A daughter, a child he never knew existed. The revelation gnawed at his very identity. Arthur tried to piece together the timeline. Clara had been so open about their decision not to have children, claiming it was never the right time. He'd accepted it, believing their love was enough to sustain them. But had that been a facade? How could she have carried a secret so heavy without him noticing? Unable to sit still, Arthur moved to the study. He opened a drawer and began rummaging through old photographs, letters, and mementos. He was searching for something, anything, that might explain what he had just learned. Among the papers, he found a stack of letters Clara had written to him early in their relationship. They spoke of love and dreams for the future, but nothing hinted at a child she had given away. He set the letters aside, frustrated. His hands were shaking, not just with anger but with a deep sadness. Clara, the woman he had idolized for decades, was no longer the perfect figure he'd held onto. She had flaws, secrets, and the knowledge left a chasm in his heart. The next day, Arthur forced himself to leave the house. The weight of the discovery demanded answers, and he knew they wouldn't come from staring at walls or old photographs. He needed to find Isabel. She had to know more, had to explain what she knew about Clara's life before their marriage. Arthur found Isabel sitting on a bench in a nearby park, her baby asleep in a stroller beside her. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mix of apprehension and determination. "I need answers," Arthur said, his voice rough but steady. Isabel nodded, as though she had expected this. "I don't know much," she admitted. "I only found out about her a few months ago. My adoptive parents passed away last year, and while going through their belongings, I found documents that mentioned my birth mother. Her name was Clara Miller." Arthur sat beside her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the wife he had adored. "And your father?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Isabel hesitated, lowering her gaze. "I don't know. There's no name on the documents. It only said she was young and unmarried when she had me." Arthur's stomach twisted. Clara had been pregnant before their marriage, before they'd even met. He had never asked much about her life before him, assuming that the love they built was all that mattered. But now, the pieces he'd ignored began to form a picture he didn't want to see. "Why now?" Arthur asked, his voice quieter. "Why come to her grave after all these years?" "I wanted to know her," Isabel said simply. "I didn't know where else to go. This grave is all I have of her." Her words struck a chord in Arthur. For decades, he had visited that grave, pouring his grief and love into a place that had become a sanctuary. The idea of sharing it with a stranger, someone who, despite being a part of Clara, was alien to him, felt almost sacrilegious. But at the same time, he couldn't deny Isabel's pain. Over the next few days, Arthur found himself reflecting on Isabel's story. He couldn't shake the image of her holding her baby in the rain, or the quiet sadness in her eyes when she spoke of her adoptive parents' death. Despite his anger and confusion, he felt a strange connection to her, as though she were a bridge to Clara that he hadn't expected. Arthur decided to dig deeper. He contacted old friends and acquaintances who had known Clara before their marriage. Most had little to offer, vague recollections of a young woman full of life and energy. But one name kept coming up, Gabriel Costa. Gabriel had been one of Clara's closest friends before her relationship with Arthur. He had disappeared from their lives shortly after their engagement, and Arthur hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, with the revelation of Isabel, Gabriel's absence felt significant. Arthur managed to track Gabriel down. The man lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the vibrant circles they once shared. Arthur's heart pounded as he knocked on the door, unsure of what he would find or what he would feel. When Gabriel opened the door, Arthur was struck by how much he had aged. His once dark hair was streaked with gray, and his posture was stooped, as though life had worn him down. Gabriel's surprise at seeing Arthur was evident, but he invited him inside without hesitation. The conversation was strained at first, filled with pleasantries that neither of them meant. Finally, Arthur cut to the chase. "Gabriel, I need to know about Clara. Before we were married, did she ever mention a child?" Gabriel froze, his expression shifting from confusion to something else. Guilt, perhaps? He looked down, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Why are you asking this now, Arthur?" Arthur explained what he had learned about Isabel, watching Gabriel's reaction carefully. The man's face paled, and his hands trembled. "I didn't know," Gabriel said finally, his voice heavy. "If Clara had a child, she never told me." Arthur wasn't sure if he believed him. He pressed further, asking about their relationship, about why Gabriel had disappeared from their lives. Gabriel admitted that he and Clara had been romantically involved briefly, but it had ended before Arthur and Clara began dating. "I left because I didn't want to get in the way," Gabriel said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought she was happier with you. I didn't know about any of this." Arthur left Gabriel's house feeling more conflicted than ever. The man's sincerity seemed genuine, but the idea that both of them had been kept in the dark by Clara was difficult to bear. As he drove home, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that he was chasing a ghost, one that had left behind more questions than answers. That night, Arthur sat in his study, the papers and photos he had gathered spread out before him. The weight of Clara's secrets pressed heavily on his chest, but amidst the pain, there was a flicker of something else. Hope. For all the hurt and betrayal he felt, Isabel and her child represented a part of Clara he had never known. Perhaps through them, he could find a way to reconcile the love he still carried for his wife with the truth of who she was. Arthur spent the next day in his study, staring at Clara's old photo albums and letters, searching for meaning in fragments of a life he thought he fully understood. The silence in the house had never felt so oppressive. His mind kept returning to Isabel and the child she held. Clara's daughter, his grandson. The thought was both surreal and inescapable. He replayed his conversation with Gabriel. The man had seemed genuinely unaware of Isabel's existence, yet his involvement with Clara made it difficult for Arthur to trust his denial completely. Clara had kept them both in the dark, but why? Was she ashamed? Protecting someone? Protecting herself? Later that afternoon, Arthur made his way to the park where he had last spoken with Isabel. To his relief, she was there again, sitting on the same bench, rocking her son in the stroller. As Arthur approached, Isabel looked up, her face guarded but not unkind. "I didn't expect to see you again," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to come," Arthur admitted, taking a seat beside her. "But I've been thinking about what you told me." Isabel nodded, brushing her hair out of her face. "I understand if this is too much for you. It's been overwhelming for me too." Arthur studied her carefully. She had Clara's eyes, the same soft brown hue, though Isabel's carried a weight that seemed older than her years. "I've spoken to someone from Clara's past," he said, his voice measured. "Gabriel Costa. Do you know that name?" Isabel hesitated, shaking her head. "No. Should I? He was close to Clara once. He claims he didn't know anything about you, but..." Arthur trailed off, unsure how much to reveal. "Clara kept many secrets, it seems." Isabel's expression softened, and for the first time, Arthur saw vulnerability behind her guarded exterior. "I've thought about that a lot," she said. "Why she gave me up, why she didn't tell anyone. I've tried to come up with answers, but all I have are more questions." Arthur leaned back on the bench, feeling the weight of her words. "I loved Clara deeply," he said after a long pause. "But now, I feel like I only knew part of her. You've brought me face to face with a version of her I never imagined." Isabel glanced at her son, Lucas, who gurgled softly in his sleep. "And how do you feel about me?" Arthur hesitated. "I don't know yet," he admitted honestly. "This is all unexpected. I've spent 2 decades mourning Clara, and now I find out she left behind something, someone, so significant." He gestured to Lucas. "You're her legacy, whether she intended it or not." Isabel offered a faint smile. "I don't want to disrupt your life, Mr. Miller. I just wanted to understand where I come from. Meeting you was never part of the plan." Arthur regarded her in silence for a moment before speaking. "You've already disrupted it, but maybe that's not such a bad thing." For the first time, they shared a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of the strange connection between them. Over the following weeks, Arthur and Isabel began meeting regularly. Their conversations were tentative at first, circling around Clara and the mysteries she left behind. Isabel shared stories of her adoptive parents, who had loved her but kept her origins a secret. Arthur, in turn, spoke of his life with Clara, painting a picture of the woman Isabel had never known. Through these interactions, Arthur began to see Isabel as more than a reminder of Clara's secrets. She was her own person, resilient, intelligent, and devoted to her son. Lucas, with his wide, curious eyes, quickly became a bright spot in Arthur's otherwise somber world. But even as their bond grew, Arthur's need for answers remained. He continued digging through Clara's past, trying to piece together the circumstances that had led to Isabel's birth and adoption. Eventually, his search led him to a small town several hours away, where records indicated Clara had lived briefly before their marriage. Arthur made the trip alone, driving through winding roads and unfamiliar landscapes. When he arrived, he sought out the town's archives, poring over old documents and hospital records. Finally, he found what he was looking for. Clara's name listed in the maternity ward records of a local hospital, dated just months before she had returned to the city and met Arthur. The revelation was both a relief and a blow. It confirmed what Isabel had told him, but it also made Clara's actions feel all the more deliberate. She had chosen to keep her pregnancy and her child a secret. On his way back home, Arthur stopped at a small diner to gather his thoughts. He stared at the records in his hands, the implications sinking in. Clara had been alone in a strange town, facing a life-altering decision. Had she been afraid? Ashamed? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered. When Arthur returned to the city, he called Isabel to share what he had found. They met at his mansion this time, the grandeur of the estate a stark contrast to the simplicity of Isabel's life. As they sat in the study, Arthur laid the documents on the table between them. "She was here," he said, pointing to the records. "This is where she had you." Isabel traced the lines of text with her fingers, her expression unreadable. "She was so young," she murmured. "I can't imagine how scared she must have been." Arthur nodded, his chest tightening. "Neither can I. But it doesn't excuse the fact that she never told me. Or you." Isabel looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "We'll never know why she made the choices she did," she said. "But I think we both know she believed she was doing what was best at the time." Arthur's gaze fell on Lucas, who was crawling on the floor, happily oblivious to the heavy conversation around him. For the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the child. "Maybe it's time I stop focusing on what I've lost and start looking at what I've been given." Isabel smiled faintly. "I think she would want that." Arthur nodded, feeling a tentative sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in decades, he felt he wasn't walking it alone. Arthur's determination to understand Clara's choices deepened as days turned into weeks. Despite his budding connection with Isabel and Lucas, the questions about Clara's life before him haunted him. Why had she chosen to give up her child? Was it purely circumstance, or were there other forces at play? One morning, Arthur sifted through a box of Clara's belongings he had tucked away in the attic after her death. Among the items, old photographs, journals, and letters, he discovered an envelope with faded writing. It was addressed to Gabriel Costa. Arthur hesitated, his pulse quickening. Why would Clara have kept a letter for Gabriel all these years? Carefully, he opened it and read the words she had written. The letter was brief but heartfelt. In it, Clara apologized to Gabriel for their relationship and admitted that she had been pregnant. She expressed uncertainty about whether to keep the child and fear of how Gabriel would react. But what struck Arthur most was her final line. "Whatever happens, please know that I did what I thought was right, for you, for me, and for the child." Arthur set the letter down, his hands trembling. Clara had kept Gabriel in the dark, just as she had kept Arthur. The realization left him conflicted. While he understood her fear and vulnerability, he couldn't reconcile her secrecy with the openness he had always associated with their relationship. The next day, Arthur decided to visit Gabriel again, carrying the letter with him. He found the man sitting on his front porch, his health visibly deteriorating since their last meeting. Gabriel greeted him with a weak smile, but seemed wary of Arthur's intense expression. "I found this," Arthur said, handing Gabriel the letter. Gabriel read it slowly, his eyes widening as he absorbed the words. When he finished, he slumped back in his chair, looking more broken than ever. "She never told me," Gabriel said, his voice barely a whisper. "I had no idea she was pregnant." All this time I thought she moved on because she didn't love me. But now, Gabriel's words trailed off, and Arthur felt a pang of empathy despite his lingering anger. She didn't give you a chance to know, Arthur said, his tone softer than he expected. And she didn't give me a chance either. Gabriel looked up at Arthur, his eyes clouded with guilt. If I had known, I would have done something. Anything. She should have told me. Arthur nodded, his own thoughts racing. She should have told both of us. But she didn't. And now we're left to pick up the pieces. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared grief hanging between them. Finally, Gabriel spoke again. What do you plan to do now? Arthur hesitated. I've started to get to know Isabel. And her son, Lucas. He paused, then added, she's not just Clara's daughter. She's mine too, in a way. Even if I didn't know it at the time. Gabriel nodded, his expression pained but understanding. Then don't waste the chance you've been given. Clara may have made her choices, but you can make yours. The conversation left Arthur both unsettled and resolved. Gabriel's regret was palpable, and it mirrored Arthur's own feelings. But as he drove away from Gabriel's house, Arthur realized that his focus needed to shift. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the present, and perhaps the future. That evening, Arthur invited Isabel and Lucas to dinner at his mansion. Isabel hesitated at first, and used to such grandeur, but Arthur reassured her that the invitation was about connection, not formality. As they sat at the long dining table, the atmosphere was tense at first. Isabel seemed uncomfortable in the opulence of Arthur's home, and Arthur himself was unsure how to bridge the gap between their vastly different lives. But Lucas, oblivious to the tension, brought a warmth to the room. His giggles and playful energy were infectious, and soon the three of them were laughing together. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Lucas toddled around, exploring the unfamiliar space. Arthur watched him with a mixture of amusement and melancholy. He reminds me of Clara, he said quietly. Isabel looked at him, her expression thoughtful. You loved her a lot, didn't you? Arthur nodded, his gaze distant. She was my everything. Losing her was like losing a part of myself. He hesitated before adding, but learning about you has made me realize how much I didn't know about her. It's complicated. Isabel smiled faintly. I think it always is with family. But I'm glad we found each other, even if it wasn't in the way either of us expected. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. The past was still a heavy burden, but it no longer felt like a prison. Through Isabel and Lucas, he saw a path forward, a way to honor Clara's memory while embracing the life she had left behind. The evening ended with Arthur walking Isabel and Lucas to the door. As he watched them disappear into the night, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. Clara's secrets had shaken him to his core, but they had also given him something he hadn't expected, a second chance at family. Arthur returned to the study, staring once again at the letter Clara had written to Gabriel. He folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. There were still questions, still loose ends, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them, one step at a time. The days that followed Arthur's dinner with Isabel and Lucas felt different. There was a shift in the air, a subtle, yet undeniable change. The mansion, once cold and hollow, began to feel a little less like a mausoleum to his past, and a little more like a home again. It wasn't just the presence of Isabel and her son. It was the realization that perhaps, despite the betrayals and the years of grief, he had room to build something new. Arthur continued his routine visits to the cemetery, but this time, something was different. Clara's grave no longer held the same all-consuming weight. As he sat on the cool stone bench near her tombstone, he could feel the presence of the woman he had loved, but there was no longer the overwhelming sense of finality he had once felt. The connection he had with Isabel, however fragile, seemed to bridge the divide between the present and the past. Clara's absence was still painful, but it was no longer all-encompassing. He stood up, placing a hand on the engraved letters of Clara's name, and whispered, I'm trying, Clara. I'm trying to move forward. The next week, Arthur invited Isabel and Lucas again, this time to spend the afternoon in the garden. The afternoon sun bathed the grounds in warm light, and for the first time, the air didn't feel oppressive. Isabel, though still out of place among the lush surroundings, seemed to relax as she watched Lucas toddling around, his small feet sinking into the grass. I never thought I'd see him in a place like this, Isabel said, her voice tinged with amazement. This house is so different from what I know. Arthur watched as Lucas reached for a flower, his tiny fingers brushing the delicate petals. It's different from what I know too, he replied, his voice softer than usual. They sat together, the space between them still awkward, but less uncomfortable. "I've been thinking a lot about Clara," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on Lucas as the boy giggled, oblivious to the emotional weight of the conversation. "About the secrets she kept, about the life she never told me about. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive her for that." Isabel nodded, understanding in her quiet way. "I don't think forgiveness is something that happens overnight. It's a process." She paused before continuing, her tone thoughtful. "I can't speak for her. I don't know why she did what she did. But I do know that she was human like the rest of us. She made choices, some of which I'm sure she regretted." Arthur let her words sink in. The idea of forgiveness had always felt like an impossible mountain to climb. How could he forgive Clara for keeping a part of her life hidden from him, for keeping him in the dark about Isabel? But Isabel was right. He couldn't move forward with a heart full of anger and resentment. He would have to find a way to forgive, not just Clara, but himself for allowing so many years to pass in grief, with no hope of healing. "I'm trying to understand," Arthur said, his voice quieter now, as though speaking the words out loud made them more real. "I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive her, but I can't keep living in the past. I can't keep holding on to all this anger and pain." Isabel glanced at him, her eyes filled with a wisdom beyond her years. "It's not about forgetting what happened," she said. "It's about finding a way to let go of the things that are holding you back. The past is part of us, but it doesn't have to define us forever." Arthur stared at the ground, the weight of her words hanging heavy between them. He realized that Isabel, despite the years of loss she had experienced, had found a way to move forward. She had a son, a new chapter to write. And now, in some strange way, he was a part of that. Later that day, as they sat in the living room, Arthur watched Lucas play with a toy, his laughter filling the room. A smile tugged at Arthur's lips. He hadn't smiled like this in years. Isabel noticed the change in his demeanor. "You seem different today," she remarked, her voice gentle. Arthur looked at her, his heart swelling with a new sense of hope. "Maybe I am. Maybe I'm starting to see things differently." They spoke for a while longer, but the conversation felt lighter. Isabel shared more of her life, of her struggles as a single mother, the difficulty of raising a child with little support. Arthur listened intently, hearing the strength in her words. Despite everything, Isabel had built a life. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. By the time they left, Arthur felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The weight of Clara's secrets hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt like it was suffocating him. Isabel had given him a gift, one he hadn't expected, the possibility of new beginnings. That night, Arthur sat alone in his study, the old letter from Clara still on his desk. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. Her words still stung, but for the first time, they didn't break him. He understood that Clara had her own fears and regrets. She had done what she thought was best, even if it meant keeping secrets from the people she loved most. Arthur sighed deeply, then placed the letter back in its envelope and tucked it away. He wasn't ready to burn it or throw it away. He wasn't ready to forget Clara, but he was ready to move forward. The past would always be part of him, but it didn't have to control his future. He stood up, looking out the window at the darkening sky. The night felt different. He could almost hear Clara's voice in his mind, comforting him in a way he hadn't known he needed. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had been right all along. Life was meant to be lived forward, not backward. Arthur Miller knew that he had a long way to go. But for the first time in over 2 decades, he felt the stirrings of something he had long ago given up on: hope. And that, he realized, was enough for now. As the weeks passed, Arthur found himself slowly adjusting to his new reality. The mansion, once a fortress of memories and mourning, began to feel a little less like a tomb and a little more like a home. Isabel and Lucas continued to visit, and though Arthur couldn't quite explain it, he started looking forward to those moments. He never expected to find comfort in the company of a woman he had just met, nor in the presence of a child who was, in so many ways, the embodiment of his greatest loss. But with every visit, something shifted within him. Isabel's resilience, her quiet strength in the face of everything life had thrown at her, was contagious. And Lucas was the light that broke through the clouds. Every time Arthur held him, his heart seemed to soften in ways he didn't know were possible. He saw Clara in Lucas's smile, in the way he reached for him with his tiny hands, and it made him ache with a mix of love and regret. One crisp morning, as Arthur stood on the balcony of his study, watching the city wake up below, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He had spent so many years consumed by the weight of Clara's death, by the void her absence left in his life. But now there was something else, something that felt, however fragile, like a second chance. Arthur had been reluctant to admit it to himself at first, but he had started to think about the future. His future. He could no longer live in the shadow of Clara's memory, unable to move forward. For the first time, he considered the possibility that there might be more to life than the painful remnants of the past. Isabel and Lucas were reminders that life, in all its complexity, continued. And perhaps, just perhaps, Arthur could find a place in it again. The following Sunday, Arthur invited Isabel to join him for a walk through the city. He had begun to feel more at ease with the idea of being around her, less like a stranger and more like someone who had a part to play in this unexpected story. Isabel agreed, and they met at the edge of the park. Lucas, as always, was in tow, his small hands clutching a toy car as they strolled through the tree-lined streets. "I've been thinking," Arthur began as they walked, his voice tentative, "about what you said, that forgiveness is a process. I think I'm starting to understand what that means." Isabel glanced at him, her eyes kind. Forgiveness doesn't happen overnight, but it's also not something you can do alone. It's about letting go of the anger and learning to move forward. Arthur nodded. "I've spent so many years locked in a grief I couldn't move past. But I think I'm finally ready to forgive Clara. Not just for keeping Isabel a secret, but for all the things she never told me." Isabel looked up at the sky, her face contemplative. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened," she said softly. "It doesn't change the past, but it makes room for something else. For peace, for new memories." Arthur found himself thinking of the man he had been before Clara's death, of the life they had shared, of their dreams for the future. But he also thought of who he was now, the man learning to live with the echoes of the past while reaching toward the future. "You're right," he said quietly. "I think I've spent so long holding on to the hurt that I never allowed myself the space to heal. And maybe it's time I let that go." Isabel smiled gently. "I'm glad to hear you say that. Clara might not have been perfect, but she loved you. I think she would want you to be at peace." The walk continued, the silence between them comfortable for the first time in weeks. Arthur felt lighter, as if a weight had slowly begun to lift from his chest. They walked along the river, watching as the water sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own life. As the evening drew near, they stopped by a small cafe for tea. Lucas, now content with his snack, sat on the floor next to them, occasionally giggling at the passing strangers. Arthur watched them, Isabel, strong yet gentle, and Lucas, full of life and innocence, and realized that for all the pain of the past, there was something beautiful about this moment. This was a new beginning. That night, as he lay in bed, Arthur felt an unfamiliar peace settle over him. He had started the journey of forgiveness, not just toward Clara but toward himself. He had spent so long focusing on what had been lost, on the absence of Clara, that he had failed to see the new life growing around him. Isabel and Lucas had brought him something unexpected, a chance to rebuild, to reconnect with the world, to be a part of something again. In the quiet of the night, Arthur closed his eyes and thought of Clara. He no longer carried the bitterness he once did. He could still love her in his own way, but he could also let go of the anger and the grief. He had learned that healing didn't come from holding on to the past, but from accepting it and finding a way forward. The next day, Arthur called Isabel. He had made a decision. "I think it's time for me to make things right," he said, his voice steady. "I want to be a part of your life, of Lucas's life. I want to make up for the years I wasted, the time I couldn't give you. I'm not asking for anything in return, but I want to be there, for both of you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Arthur held his breath. Finally, Isabel's voice came through, warm and tentative. "I think that would mean a lot to us." Arthur smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in years. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would still be hard days, still moments of doubt and regret. But for the first time, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, Arthur made his intentions clear. He continued spending time with Isabel and Lucas, and while he knew there was much left unsaid, there was a growing sense of understanding between them. He had come to see that the family he had once lost was still there, waiting for him to reach out. And for the first time in over 2 decades, Arthur Miller began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, a new beginning was possible after all. As the months went by, the changes in Arthur were palpable. His life, once bound by the confines of past grief, began to shift in ways he had never expected. The visits with Isabel and Lucas became regular, as much a part of his routine as the business meetings he used to attend. Arthur found himself waking each day with a quiet anticipation, something he hadn't felt in years. He had taken Isabel's words to heart. The past doesn't define us forever. He was learning slowly to accept Clara's choices, the secrets she had carried, and the consequences of those secrets. But he was also learning to let those things go, not to forget them, but to stop allowing them to dominate his present and future. Isabel had become a steady presence in his life, a reminder of what Clara had kept hidden. But she was also a person in her own right, with her own story, her own pain, and her own strengths. Arthur respected that, and in some ways, he admired Isabel's quiet resilience. She was not a replacement for Clara. She was someone entirely new, but still connected to her in a way that was both comforting and heartbreaking. One evening, as Arthur and Isabel sat together in the library, the soft hum of the fireplace filling the silence, she turned to him with a hesitant look. "Arthur," she began, her voice uncharacteristically unsure. "I know we've talked a lot about Clara in the past, but I don't know if we've ever really talked about the present. About us." Arthur looked up from his book, his gaze softening as he met her eyes. "What do you mean?" Isabel shifted in her chair, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I mean, we've built something, right? This connection, this new thing between us. And I appreciate it more than I can say. But I don't want you to feel like you have to keep me around because of Clara. Or because of guilt." Arthur felt a pang in his chest at her words. He understood what she was saying. There were times when he, too, had wondered whether his feelings for Isabel and Lucas were born out of duty, out of some misplaced sense of responsibility toward Clara's memory. But he knew deep down that wasn't it. He had come to care for Isabel as an individual, someone who, despite everything, had brought something invaluable into his life. "I don't feel that way," Arthur replied, his voice steady. "I'm not here because of Clara. I'm here because of you and Lucas." He paused, taking a deep breath. "You've given me something I didn't realize I needed, a chance to feel alive again. I didn't even know I'd been dead inside all this time." Isabel's eyes softened, and for the first time, Arthur saw a flicker of vulnerability in her. She reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "I didn't realize either," she said quietly. "But I'm glad we're here. Whatever this is between us, I'm grateful." The moment hung between them, charged with a quiet understanding. They weren't the same as they had been before. Arthur had changed, Isabel had changed, but in that shared space, they were something new. They were still learning what it meant to be in each other's lives, still finding their way. But for the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. Later that week, as Arthur drove through the city streets, a sense of purpose began to settle in his chest. He had spent so much of his life running from the truth, running from the past, and he realized now that he was finally ready to confront the future, on his own terms. He didn't need to carry the weight of guilt or anger anymore. He could move forward with purpose, with the possibility of real connection. That evening, after dinner, Arthur decided it was time to confront another part of his past. He had been avoiding Gabriel for weeks, unsure of what to say, unsure of what was left between them. But he knew that in order to fully move forward, he needed to have closure with the man who had once been a close friend and who, in many ways, had been the catalyst for the secrets that had upended his life. He picked up the phone and dialed Gabriel's number. It rang several times before Gabriel's familiar, tired voice answered. "Arthur?" Gabriel's voice was weak, but there was a note of surprise in it. "Is everything okay?" Arthur paused for a moment, then spoke, his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About Clara, about you, about me." Gabriel was silent for a beat before responding. "I can't imagine how all this feels for you, Arthur. I'm sorry for the part one played in all of it." Arthur took a deep breath. "I'm not calling to blame you, Gabriel. I've been doing a lot of blaming lately, and it's not getting me anywhere. I'm calling because I think it's time for both of us to stop living in the past. To move forward, if that's even possible." There was another pause, but this one was different, softer, almost reflective. "I don't know how to fix any of it, Arthur. But I'd like to try, if you're willing to give me the chance." Arthur's grip tightened on the phone as he considered Gabriel's words. For the first time, he felt a shift in his heart, a willingness to forgive, to let go of the anger that had burned between them for so long. It wasn't easy. Nothing was easy when it came to Clara's memory, to the truth of what had been hidden. But forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about excusing the past. It was about freeing himself from its grip. "I'm willing," Arthur said, his voice thick. "But it'll take time, and I can't promise it'll be simple." Gabriel's voice broke with emotion. "I don't need promises, Arthur. I just need a chance." Arthur nodded, though Gabriel couldn't see it. Then let's take it one step at a time. The conversation ended on a note of tentative understanding. It was the beginning of something new, not just for Arthur, but for Gabriel as well. A bridge that had long been broken had begun to heal, one fragile step at a time. As Arthur sat back in his chair, a sense of quiet resolution washed over him. The pain of the past still lingered, as it always would, but he was learning how to live with it. He was learning how to move forward, not in spite of his losses, but because of them. He had a family now, of sorts. Isabel and Lucas, Gabriel, and even the memories of Clara. Together, they formed the tapestry of his life, imperfect and complicated, but real. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Arthur looked out over the sprawling view from his mansion's balcony. The world felt a little different now. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it also felt full of possibilities. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. The weeks that followed Arthur's conversation with Gabriel were marked by a quiet, steady change. The anger that had once consumed him slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile peace that he hadn't known in years. Gabriel reached out more often, eager to mend the friendship they had lost, though the weight of their shared history was never far from the surface. But Arthur could see the sincerity in Gabriel's efforts, and over time, his resentment softened. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the past resurfaced with a vengeance, threatening to pull them back into the abyss of hurt and regret. But for every difficult conversation, there was a new, tentative moment of connection. Whether it was sharing a memory of Clara or simply sitting in silence, two men bound by their past but slowly learning to be in each other's present. Arthur found himself thinking less about Clara's secrets and more about the future. Isabel and Lucas had become integral parts of his life, not as remnants of Clara's memory, but as people in their own right. Isabel, with her quiet strength, had become someone he respected, even admired. The bond between them was still new, but it had the potential to grow into something meaningful. Lucas, too, had worked his way into Arthur's heart in a way that surprised him. The child's boundless energy and innocence brought a warmth to Arthur's home that he hadn't realized was missing. One afternoon, as Arthur walked through the city, a thought began to take shape in his mind. He had spent so many years building his empire, achieving success in the business world, but what had he truly built for himself? He had spent decades chasing goals and accomplishments, thinking they would fill the void left by Clara's death. But they hadn't. Nothing had. Now he realized he was learning what it meant to build something more personal, more enduring. A family, a connection, a life worth living, not for the past, but for the present and the future. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally start building it from the ground up. Later that week, Arthur invited Isabel and Lucas to spend the day at the beach. It was a small gesture, but for Arthur, it felt significant. It was an opportunity to step away from the formality of his mansion, to spend time together in a place that was more neutral, more relaxed. The drive was long, but the moment they arrived, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was immediately soothing. Lucas ran ahead, his small legs carrying him as fast as they could go, while Isabel and Arthur followed at a slower pace. The sand was soft beneath their feet, and the sky stretched endlessly above them. Arthur watched Isabel as they walked, noticing the way she seemed at ease, the way she smiled as she watched Lucas play. It was strange, he thought, how quickly they had come to know each other, how much she had become a part of his life in such a short time. He had once feared that their connection would always be tainted by the secrets of the past, but now he saw it for what it was, a chance at something new. "I'm glad we're here," Arthur said, his voice gentle. "I never would have thought I'd find peace in a place like this, but here I am." Isabel smiled, glancing at him. "It's funny, isn't it? How life works. You think you have everything figured out, and then it turns out that what you really need is something entirely different." Arthur nodded. "I spent so many years chasing the wrong things, but I'm beginning to understand that it's not about what you achieve. It's about who you're with when you get there." They reached the water's edge, and Lucas splashed through the shallow surf, laughing as the waves lapped at his feet. Isabel followed after him, calling his name with a laugh. Arthur stood for a moment, watching them, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This simple moment was everything. As the afternoon wore on, Arthur and Isabel talked more openly than they had before. Isabel shared her thoughts about the future, her hopes for her son, and the way she had come to terms with her own past. Arthur, in turn, spoke about his own struggles, his fear of being too late to find happiness again. "You're not too late," Isabel said, her voice steady. "You're right where you need to be. Arthur met her gaze and saw the sincerity in her eyes. It was a moment of clarity, of quiet understanding. He didn't need to chase the past anymore. He didn't need to hold on to the grief, the pain, the memories of what had been lost. He had a new purpose now. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Arthur stood at the water's edge. He felt a calm that he hadn't experienced in years, a peace that seemed to settle deep inside him. He was no longer the man he had been, bound by sorrow and regret. He was learning slowly to be someone else, a man with hope, with new connections, with a future that was still unwritten. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that future could be everything he had always hoped for. Underscore 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 underscore. The following months unfolded like a story Arthur hadn't thought possible. Isabel and Lucas became fixtures in his life. They spent holidays together, had dinners at his mansion, and shared moments that Arthur once thought could never happen again. His relationship with Gabriel, though still complicated, deepened into something resembling friendship. They talked often, not just about Clara, but about the things that mattered now. Arthur threw himself into the business world once more, but this time with a different mindset. He wasn't driven by the need to prove himself anymore. He was driven by the need to create something meaningful, not just for himself, but for those he cared about. And so, with each passing day, Arthur Miller's world grew wider, richer, more complex. He had learned to embrace the uncertainties, the messiness, and the beauty of life. He had learned that forgiveness, though difficult, was the key to freedom. And most of all, he had learned that while the past would always be a part of him, it didn't have to define him. As the years stretched out before him, Arthur felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had found his way back to life, not the life he had once imagined, but a life that was more real, more honest, and more fulfilling than he could have ever hoped for. And with Isabel and Lucas by his side, he knew he wasn't walking this path alone anymore. For the first time in a long time, Arthur Miller felt truly at peace. Time moved forward as it always does, unpredictable, relentless, and yet somehow gentle in the way it shapes us. For Arthur Miller, each passing day brought him closer to the man he was becoming. A man who no longer lived in the shadow of grief, but who had learned to embrace the fullness of life with all its complexities. Isabel and Lucas had become a constant presence in his life, as natural to him as the rhythms of his business. They were no longer just remnants of his past with Clara, but people in their own right. Isabel, with her quiet strength and unwavering resolve, had become someone he trusted implicitly. And Lucas, oh Lucas, was the living, breathing joy that filled the gaps left by so many years of sorrow. Arthur often found himself thinking about how little he had understood about life before. He had spent so many years focused on the past, on the success that had never brought him happiness, on the love he had lost, on the pain that had never truly healed. But now, with Isabel and Lucas, he realized that the beauty of life wasn't in what was lost or what could have been, but in what was present, in the small moments of connection that slowly, imperceptibly, wove the fabric of a meaningful existence. One Sunday afternoon, as autumn leaves swirled outside the windows of the mansion, Arthur and Isabel sat together in the library. Lucas had just finished his nap, and he was playing with his toy cars on the floor. Isabel looked up from the book she was reading and met Arthur's gaze. "I've been thinking," Isabel began, her voice soft but thoughtful, "about what you said a while ago, about how we're not defined by the past." Arthur smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "I think I've learned what that really means. It's hard though, isn't it? Letting go of the things that weigh you down. I never realized how much I was carrying until I started to let it go." Isabel nodded. "I know exactly what you mean. I thought for so long that the weight of my past would crush me, but..." She paused, her eyes drifting to Lucas as he giggled and rolled his toy cars across the floor. "But it's not the past that defines us. It's how we move forward, how we live now." Arthur looked at her, seeing in her the same understanding he had come to grasp for himself. The wounds of the past, no matter how deep, didn't have to dictate their futures. They could choose to live for today, to embrace the uncertainty of tomorrow, and to find peace in the present. "I'm glad we found each other," Arthur said quietly, his voice sincere. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to say that after everything, but I am. I don't think I could have moved forward without you and Lucas." Isabel's smile was soft, filled with understanding. I'm glad too. I never thought I'd be part of something like this. I never thought I'd have a family like this. Arthur's gaze softened as he looked at her, then down at Lucas, who was now giggling as he pushed his cars in a circle. In that moment, the weight of all that had come before seemed to fade away. It wasn't about the things they couldn't change anymore. It was about the life they were building together, the family they were becoming, fragmented by the past, yes, but stronger for it. Their days became a mixture of quiet moments and shared joy. They continued to spend weekends together, whether at Arthur's mansion or exploring the city. They went on trips to the countryside, taking time to reconnect with the world outside their own little bubble. Through it all, Arthur found himself learning new lessons about love, loss, and what it meant to be truly alive. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Arthur turned to Isabel with a thought that had been on his mind for days. "Isabel, have you ever thought about what comes next?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet but palpable weight. "I mean, after everything we've been through, what comes after the healing?" Isabel looked at him thoughtfully, her eyes filled with the wisdom that had grown between them. "I think what comes next is just living. It's letting go of the fear, letting go of the uncertainty, and just moving forward." She paused, her gaze drifting to Lucas, who was chasing a butterfly near the edge of the garden. "We've already been through the hardest part. The rest is just living the life we've been given." Arthur looked out at the horizon, where the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting a golden glow across the landscape. "I spent so many years thinking that life was about control, about having everything in order. But now I see that it's not about control at all. It's about letting life unfold as it will, accepting what comes and finding peace in it." Isabel reached for his hand, her grip steady and warm. "And finding joy in it," she added. "Even in the uncertainty. Especially in the uncertainty." Arthur smiled, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. He had spent so much of his life searching for answers, trying to understand why things had happened the way they did. But now, he knew the answer was simpler than he had ever imagined. Life wasn't about searching for some grand meaning. It was about embracing the moments, however small, that made life worth living. That night, after dinner, Arthur sat with Isabel on the porch, the cool night air carrying the scent of pine and earth. They watched as the stars slowly filled the sky, one by one. Lucas had fallen asleep in Isabel's arms, his small form nestled against her chest. The world seemed at peace, and for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt that peace settle in his own heart. "I think we've got this," Arthur said softly, more to himself than to Isabel. "We've figured out how to live in the present. And that's enough." Isabel's eyes sparkled in the dim light of the porch, and she squeezed his hand gently. "It is enough," she agreed. And for Arthur Miller, it truly was enough. The past no longer haunted him, as it once had. The future was still unknown, but he wasn't afraid of it anymore. He had found his place, his peace, and his family. And in the quiet, starry night, Arthur finally understood what it meant to live fully, without the chains of regret or fear holding him back. For the first time in a long time, Arthur felt truly free. As the seasons continued to change, so did Arthur's sense of self. What had begun as a fragile attempt to heal from loss had blossomed into something far more profound. Each day spent with Isabel and Lucas deepened his understanding of what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. Something that transcended the loneliness that had defined much of his life. The mansion, once a place of memories too painful to revisit, now felt like a space that could hold the weight of new memories, ones that were rich with life and laughter. The rooms were filled with echoes, but they were no longer echoes of sorrow. They were echoes of love, of understanding, and for the first time of acceptance. Arthur's bond with Isabel grew stronger. They found comfort in each other's company, a quiet kind of peace that had eluded them both for so long. They shared their hopes, their uncertainties, and their dreams for the future. They both knew there was still much to learn, but they were willing to take the journey together. One particularly cool autumn afternoon, Arthur and Isabel stood in the garden, watching Lucas as he ran in circles, chasing the last of the falling leaves. His laughter was like music in the stillness of the day. Arthur glanced at Isabel, feeling the warmth of the moment in a way he had never thought possible. "I used to think happiness was about having everything figured out," Arthur said softly, his voice almost a whisper against the rustling leaves. "That if I could just get everything under control, I'd be happy. But now, I see that happiness isn't about control. It's about embracing what comes, even when you don't know what's next." Isabel smiled, her eyes reflecting the understanding they had both found. "You're right. Happiness comes in the little moments, the ones we don't expect. I think we're learning that, aren't we?" Arthur nodded, his eyes following Lucas as he stumbled over a small rock, laughing as he got back on his feet. I think Lucas has it figured out. He doesn't need to know the future. He just lives in the moment. Isabel looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Maybe that's the key, living without fear of what's coming. Accepting that we can't control everything, and that, maybe we don't need to. For a moment, the two of them simply stood in silence, watching Lucas. The world seemed to fall away, leaving them with the quiet realization that they had both found something worth holding on to. A few weeks later, as the holidays approached, Arthur found himself feeling more optimistic about the future than he had in years. The traditions he had once shared with Clara now felt like distant memories, but he wasn't haunted by them. Instead, he was creating new traditions with Isabel and Lucas, ones that were full of joy, laughter, and a kind of peace he hadn't thought possible. They decorated the tree together, Lucas fascinated by the shiny ornaments as Isabel guided his small hands to hang them. Arthur watched them, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. This, he realized, was the family he had always wanted, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Isabel turned to him as they stood in front of the tree, the soft glow of the lights illuminating their faces. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she asked, her voice full of quiet wonder. Arthur smiled, his heart full. "We have, and I think we're just getting started." In the days that followed, Arthur found himself reflecting more on his life, on the decisions that had shaped him, on the things he had lost, and on the things he had gained. He thought of Clara often, but not with the same weight of sorrow that had once defined their relationship. He could still love her in his way, but now he understood that life didn't end with one chapter. It was a series of chapters, each one unfolding with new possibilities. He had come to accept the things he could not change, the secrets Clara had kept, the choices they had both made, and he had come to understand that forgiveness, though never simple, was the key to moving forward. For the first time in years, Arthur felt the freedom to live without the burden of the past pressing down on him. One evening, as the winter winds began to stir outside, Arthur sat by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and flicker. Isabel was sitting beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, Lucas asleep in the next room. For the first time in a long time, Arthur allowed himself to simply be. No expectations, no fears about the future, no regrets about the past. In that moment, he realized that the path ahead of him wasn't a straight line. It was a winding road, full of twists and turns, some expected, some completely unknown. But for the first time, he was no longer afraid to walk it. He was no longer trying to outrun his past or control his future. He was simply living. "I think I've finally found my way," Arthur murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabel's fingers tightened around his, and she smiled up at him, her eyes filled with the same quiet understanding that had brought them together. "I think you have." As the fire crackled and the world outside grew colder, Arthur felt a warmth inside. A warmth that wasn't just from the fire, but from the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. With Isabel, with Lucas, with the family they were building together, one step at a time. For the first time, Arthur Miller was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. He didn't need to know what was coming next. He had everything he needed right here, in the quiet moments of his life. And that, he realized, was enough. As time continued its steady march, Arthur found that the sense of peace he had cultivated in his life only deepened. The past, though never completely gone, no longer had the power to define him. He had built something new with Isabel and Lucas, a life that was grounded in love, in understanding, and in the quiet joy of shared moments. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Arthur looked over at Isabel, who was holding a now 6-year-old Lucas in her arms. The boy was growing quickly, and every time Arthur looked at him, he saw not only the future of the family they were building, but the potential of what was yet to come. "Do you ever think about legacy?" Arthur asked, his voice thoughtful. Isabel looked up at him, a slight smile on her lips. "Legacy? In what way?" Arthur continued, "what we leave behind. We spend so much of our lives trying to figure things out, to make a mark. But in the end, I think it's the small things that matter most. The love we give, the moments we share. That's what we really leave behind." Isabel smiled softly, glancing down at Lucas, who was playing with a ball on the grass. "I think you're right. It's not the big things that make the difference. It's the small, everyday moments. The love, the care. The way we show up for each other." Arthur watched Lucas, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. "I'm glad we're here, Isabel. I'm glad we're doing this together." "I am too," she replied, her voice soft and full of affection. As the years continued to unfold, Arthur and Isabel's life together became more than just a story of healing from the past. It became a story of creation. They weren't defined by the mistakes or the secrets of their past lives. Instead, they were creating a new legacy, one built on understanding, forgiveness, and love. Lucas, now growing into a young boy, often ran through the garden, laughing and full of energy. His laughter became the soundtrack of Arthur's life. And as the days passed, Arthur found himself content with the idea that life wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. It was about showing up, day after day, for the people who mattered most. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the world outside bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Arthur looked at Isabel, then at Lucas, and realized that, in many ways, they had given him everything he needed. A new chapter in his life had begun, one that wasn't defined by loss, but by love, by the legacy they were building together. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur Miller understood that the future, no matter what it held, would be enough. Years passed, each one folding into the next with the kind of natural flow that only time could provide. The seasons changed, the world around Arthur evolved, but within the walls of his home, where Isabel, Lucas, and the quiet understanding they shared lived, he found the steady peace he had longed for. Life, in all its messy complexity, had woven its way into his heart, leaving behind a fabric of connection, love, and shared moments that were now his true legacy. Isabel and Lucas had not only healed the parts of him that had once been broken, but had also expanded his capacity to love and embrace life once again. They had made a family where there had once only been silence and memories. His heart, once a battleground of grief, was now a place where joy could thrive, even in the face of uncertainty. On a late spring morning, as Arthur sat on the porch with Isabel, watching Lucas chase a ball down the gravel driveway, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the love they had built, for the strength Isabel had shown, and for the hope that had grown between them like the flowers blooming in the garden around their home. But more than anything, he felt a deep, quiet understanding that the journey he had walked was never linear. It was not about reaching an end, but about embracing the twists and turns that led him to this moment. "Sometimes, I still can't believe this is my life," Arthur said, his voice filled with wonder as he watched his son, no longer a baby but a vibrant young child, run around the yard. "I spent so many years haunted by the past. I thought I'd never be free of it." Isabel turned to him, her eyes gentle but knowing. "I think we both know that the past will always be there in some way, but it doesn't have to control us. It's the present, the now, that gives us the freedom to move forward." Arthur nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he watched Lucas kneel in the grass, deeply focused on picking a flower. "It's funny," he said, almost to himself, "how you can spend so much time looking back, trying to figure out what went wrong, only to realize that it's in letting go that you find peace." Isabel smiled, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "We've both learned that, haven't we?" She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We've come full circle. We've built something new together. And that's where we are now." As the day stretched on, Arthur and Isabel spent the afternoon in comfortable silence, enjoying the simplicity of each other's presence. The world felt expansive in its potential, but within the boundaries of their home, Arthur had come to understand that peace was not something to chase. It was something to embrace when it arrived, when you allowed yourself the space to appreciate it. Lucas joined them on the porch as the evening drew near, his small hands grasping at the railing as he looked up at the sky. "Look, Mommy, Daddy, look at the stars," he said, his voice full of awe. Arthur followed his son's gaze, seeing the first stars of the evening begin to appear, twinkling against the backdrop of a dusky sky. He smiled, the warmth of the moment filling him from the inside out. In that small, perfect moment, everything felt as it should be. The past was still a part of him, but it no longer held him captive. He had found the freedom he had searched for in the most unexpected of places, in the quiet love and the quiet moments that now filled his life. As night descended, the three of them sat together, watching the stars, their shadows stretching across the porch, their hearts intertwined by the simple act of being. Arthur realized then that the true legacy he would leave behind was not written in monuments or accomplishments. It was written in the love and connections he had nurtured, in the family he had built, and in the peace he had found, piece by piece. He didn't need to control what came next. He had already created something real, something lasting. And for the first time in his life, Arthur Miller could look forward with the certainty that whatever came, he was ready for it. The past was no longer a chain. It was a bridge to the future. And that was enough. In that quiet evening, surrounded by the warmth of family and the beauty of the world unfolding before them, Arthur Miller finally understood what it meant to be truly free.